You're recording it? Okay. So we're going to be looking at Post-Impressionism today and seeing how it evolved from Impressionism, focusing on emotions. So that will be our first part of it. So we did Impressionism on Tuesday, and so I wanted to look at just a real quick review because there's going to be a lot of similarities with Impressionism today, so I want to make sure we pinpoint them. So in the chat, could you guys write down some of your thoughts on in what ways did Impressionism break away from traditional painting? So think about subject matter and style. So go ahead in the chat, write down some ideas that you have about how Impressionism broke away from traditional painting in terms of subject matter and style. Okay, so go ahead and see what you guys have. Right, so a lot of it, right, is that they didn't necessarily need to be super realistic anymore with the invention of the camera and really what was going on with the salon, right? So they weren't really concerned with photorealism anymore. And so their subject matter, right, varied, right? And so there's lots of scenes of leisure, landscape, portrait, genre, upper class, middle classes with the subject matter. And there was a big emphasis, right? A big emphasis on light, weather, color, and moment of time. And I would dare say that probably the factor that ties almost all of the artists together that we looked at is that idea of capturing a moment of time. It has kind of a snapshot quality to it, right? It's like we're a voyeur looking in at the bather, or capturing a moment at a picnic, or people walking down the street. And certain artists, were really concerned with certain elements of the style. So Monet was obsessed with light and color and atmosphere and weather and reflection, right? In a moment of time, right? And so, other artists were much more like, oh, like Cabaret. He's like, oh, I'm going to do like people walking down the street, and I'm going to show the reflections of the rain in the water that's on the cobblestone, right? So they take whatever elements they were interested in, and then the style, right, really was a big range. Very few artists, right, did it exactly the same way, right? And that's the artistic concept of this avant-garde, right? These cutting-edge artists of the day. They could do whatever the heck they wanted to. So sometimes their style was really rough, like that first Impressionist painting by Monet, right? That they named the group after, right? So we have like blobs and smears and dashes and commas that kind of optically mix to create overlapping qualities of those colors, okay? So we're going to look at our emotional post-impressionists. So remember that our theme for this unit is rest in peace, our voix to tradition. And so we're looking at post-impressionism. The artists that we're going to see are mostly French. Now, Van Gogh is a Dutch artist. However, he worked out of France, so there's still a connection with France here. They were really Once again, not concerned with photorealism and accuracy. And so they kind of had different, like they're kind of a mixed bag too, just like the Impressionists. They're going to learn from the Impressionists. And so after Impressionism, we have a series of isms. And they even mentioned it in one of the videos that we looked at last week. Actually, I think it was the art assignment one. And when we look at all these isms, Post-Impressionism as well as kind of modern painting, because we really consider art after Impressionism to be what we call modern art. We are not living in a day of modern art. We are living in a day of what we call contemporary art or postmodern art. But modern art is really from about the 1860s to about the 1960s. And it's full of styles that are full of these isms. And often artists are looking at formalism or expressionism. And that's kind of how we're going to group these two sets of artists that we're going to look at today. Okay, so formalism is also often called constructivism. Okay, so what are formalists interested in? They are concerned with composition. They are concerned with organizing space. They are concerned about how the artist manipulates the viewer by arrangement and brushstroke, right? They are like almost like scientifically placing all those little dots and dashes, all those little marks. It's like very methodical, very intentional. Okay, formalists are rigid in a way. Okay, and so there's a big influence of composition, brushwork, color theory, right? So these artists were like reading research on color and trying to figure out what colors would create contrast. How do I create visual blending with different brush strokes, right? And then I don't say the opposite, but then we also have our expressionists, right? And these are our later day romantics. And if you think about romanticism, romanticism is full of emotion. So these guys and women are really interested in the emotional qualities of art, right? They're really invested in the sensations of light and color, the angst that's kind of in the depth of their soul, right? And so Van Gogh is a really good example of that. So these are all the other isms, right? These are all the isms that we normally think of when we look at this early modern period after Impressionism. A lot of times we call these artists the Post-Impressionists. Sometimes we call them Formalists. Sometimes we call them early Expressionists because we'll have another Expressionist group later around World War I. And then we also have our Symbolists or Symbolism. Right? Anyone know who this artist of this drab, sad painting is? Anyone? It's Vincent Van Gogh, right? So Vincent Van Gogh is kind of a unique character. You probably heard a lot about him through your schooling and popular culture. And so he was a untrained artist. He basically trained himself as well as emulating and talking and having conversations with many other artists. He is from Holland, and he came from a very strict family, very religious family, and he actually grew up wanting to become a minister. And when he was in school to become a minister, he refused to learn Latin because he believed it to be a dead language. So I apologize to anyone taking Latin. And so he refused to learn it, and so he got kicked out of seminary. And so instead of giving up his hopes and dreams, he actually went to work with the poor. And so he started working with these poor potato farmers, and that's actually who he's depicting in this very drab painting. So when he was with them, he started to kind of dabble in paint and started to paint the people that were around him. Okay, so once he, stopped his missionary work, he moved to Paris. And when he was in Paris, his brother Theo, he was an art gallery. He worked in the art gallery. He wasn't a dealer. He was kind of a dealer, I should say. He wasn't the owner of a gallery, but he worked for a gallery and he sold a lot of paintings. And so through Theo, Van Gogh learned about these different artists. And he'd meet with them in different cafes. He'd go around the city and the countryside of Paris, use those trains to go ahead and paint scenes in that environment. So when we look at his style, it's got a lot of impressionist sort of quality. He's going to be painting scenes outside windows, those landscapes, and so on. It's probably good to know that Van Gogh more than likely was bipolar. He, had issues with his mental health throughout his life, of course, leading to him ending his life eventually. And so him living in Paris with his brother and his family, their wife and children, was kind of difficult. So his brother eventually moves him to the south of France. He gives him money to move to Arles in the south of France. And Van Gogh was pretty happy about this because he thought, I can start an artist commune. A bunch of artists can come here and we can paint because the light in the south of France is kind of like the Mediterranean or the Caribbean. He believed it to be like light and bright, like the best environment for painting. And so he painted the scenes of Arles. So the little houses, the little yellow house that he lived in. He got Gauguin, who's in R250. He's the only artist Vincent Van Gogh convinced to come to his commune. He's the only one who actually came to work with him. And so they painted paintings of each other and gave them as gifts. So these are two gifts that they gave to each other. So Gauguin gave Vincent a portrait, and Vincent gave Gauguin a portrait. There's even, you can see that sketch of Vincent in the upper right corner of Gauguin's, right? And they had very different styles of painting. These are two artists that we're going to look at today. Van Gogh was all about like painting kind of like Monet. He went out in the community with his easel and the tube of brushes, and he painted plain air. So he would go to these places and make sketches or work on the scene, right? Now Gauguin, right, his scenes are a little bit different. These are the same location of this bar. And Gauguin was more interested in the people, and he was more interested in maybe sketching in this environment and then going back into the studio and spending hours upon hours working on his paintings in the confines of his comfort and his home. And Van Gogh's like, I don't care if it's raining, I don't care if it's dark in this bar and smoky, I'm gonna be here because this is where the action is. Right? And so when you look at the work of Van Gogh, do you think he's a formalist or an expressionist? Is he concerned about color and composition, or is he concerned with the emotional content of the work? What do you think? I feel like I gave you a tricky one here. Because I see elements of both. So we can look at the other ones too. What do you think? Is he an expressionist or is he a formalist? He's concerned only about composition and the science behind art. What do you think? Juana, can you help me out?
I think expressionism.
Right. So he's definitely an expressionist. He's full of emotion, right? Even the way that he goes out and paints in the environment, he's all about capturing that emotion. And so when he was painting his bedroom, which he painted a series of them, you've probably seen this most famous one at the Art Institute. This little room in Arles was kind of claustrophobic. He really exaggerated the perspective, right? So in Arles, he didn't have a lot of money. He was very poor. He's living off his brother. He's not really selling his artwork. He really painted a lot of the environment and people he knew. So like his landlady, right? His postman, his doctor, right? He also did a lot of images of himself. So when we look at the quality of his paintings, right, we want to think about describing the brushwork, right? How would you describe the brushstrokes of Van Gogh? Look at this portrait. How did he make these marks? What's the word you could use to describe it? Maroon, what do you think? Give me one word. Isabel, can you help him?
Maybe like rapid.
Rapid, I like that. So quick motion. These are kind of linear, so they're like lines, right? Here, they're even more chunky, notice the lines, right? These are a little bit smoother. I love this painting because this actually really does a great job of talking about how color creates mood, right? So not only is his line work expressionist, but also his color choices. He was using all of those new colors that had just been invented. That neon yellow that you see is a chemical reaction color rather than a color you find in nature. And so he's using that really sickly green, right, to kind of influence the mood of the painting. Right? Here's after he cut off part of his ear, right? I don't want to get into it too much because it's not necessarily, part of the 250, but he didn't cut off his ear because he wanted to give a gift to a woman, right? He did not. He actually had an argument with Gauguin. Gauguin said, "I'm going to leave the commune," and he got so upset he did himself harm and he cut off the top cartilage. He did cut off quite a bit of the top cartilage of his ear, but he didn't cut the whole thing off. And it was more about Gauguin than it was about falling in love with some prostitute. Right? So notice how the color, the technique, this one is much more like the swirls, like the Starry night that we'll have in our 250. So he was pretty obsessed with himself, right? And then he did scenes of the environment. So we have our neck, our cafe, we have our irises, right? And that leads us to our Starry night, which is in our 250. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to break down the content here, and we're going to break down the content. And so what I'm going to do is give you guys something to listen for on the video here. And so you're going to jot down your number and your question so that you can listen to the whole thing, but focus on yours as well. I'm just doing a count real fast. Okay, kind of perfect. So for content, what was his inspiration? I'm going to have that be Jasmine and Isabella and Emily. Okay, so Jasmine, Isabella, and Emily, you guys are number one. Okay, number two, for how is the composition organized? It's going to be Eva and Juana. 3, 4, describe the style is going to be Cora and Jeffrey. 4, how is the work different from the Impressionists? It's going to be Katie, Isabel, and Alana. 5, why the night sky is Raheel and Brianna. And then where was this work made? It's going to be Baroud and Raheel. Okay. Does everyone have what they're listening for? So write down your question. All right, write down your question for the video.
I have it twice.
Oh, because you aren't here. Do the second one. So do the 6. I forgot you were logged in. We are going to do the divine concert.
a church, a cypress tree. A picture by Vincent Van Gogh. A peaceful night in the country. Yet rest seems unlikely beneath that angry sky with its huge stars. In fact, Van Gogh painted this nightscape in a lunatic asylum. A year before, he killed himself. The rebellious cry of a genius ahead of his time? While his contemporaries succumb to the city's bright lights, Van Gogh flees Paris and gives us a stressed-out urbanite's dream. So, let us find release in the madness of art and reconnect with the quiet pleasures of country life. Is his frenzied vision of night and stars simply that, a longing for the past? Is his picture the spontaneous product of insanity? A rash conclusion. Van Gogh's Nightscape dates from 1889, when astronomy is attracting amateur enthusiasts, inspired by a string of popular handbooks containing the first ever photographs of the night sky. This spiral is based on a real nebula. Venus, nearing the end of its cycle, was unusually bright that year. And the moon is just as the painter might have seen it from his cell, before dawn on the 25th of May, 1889. But the view from Van Gogh's window stops short at a wall. So he invents a landscape, adding the cypress and the village steeple, which give the picture depth and structure it. And even the wild spiral keys in the vanishing point directly below it. If sanity rules the composition, surely madness powers the turbulent brushwork. Van Gogh is working so fast, he leaves part of the canvas bare. In fact, his handling of the paint strengthens the contrast between the picture's two halves. At the bottom, the houses are outlined in black, like the figures in a stained glass window. The trees resemble dense skeins of wool. And the earth has a carved solidity, while the sky swirls and surges like a shoal of fish, and the starlight spreads outward in concentric waves. In short, the picture's pulsing movement is a conscious effect, and Van Gogh uses it to create a powerful opposition between the earth's tangible solidity and the sky's wave-like dynamism. The cypress links them like a bridge, viscous as tar, vibrant as flame. Why does Van Gogh pump all this drama into a potentially peaceful nightscape? Van Gogh's vision of night as a star-filled sky has been preceded by another. Night as a time of release, when the day's work is done. A massive contrast with those avant-garde artists who revel in the glitter and the bustle of the after-hours city. Van Gogh takes a very different line. He sees the nobility of the peasant's dimly lit meal and the bright city's dehumanizing effect on its denizens. At first glance, primitive and gloomy, this mealtime scene, where the eaters exchange looks and words in a simple lamp's consoling glow, is a celebration of well-earned rest from labor. The family is united, like those small houses clustered round a single steeple, which stands for Christian belief. Van Gogh is not the first to celebrate the peasant's simple dignity. His revered predecessor, Jean-François Millet, has been there first. The sense of communion with heaven and earth, which pervades Millet's The Angelus, makes Van Gogh's pictures of nightlife in the city seem like visions of hell. In the dance hall in Arles, the light which brings people together has gone, and a swarm of dim lamps have taken over. Individual dancers seem lost in the whirling, hysterical throng. This is an all-night cafe, and an all-night haze of alcohol envelops it. The complementary reds and greens combine garishly. A billiard table replaces the respectable piece of furniture in the family kitchen. A passion for gaming has sapped these people's strength and also their ability to connect with one another. The drunks adrift on the edges of the picture seem to be shriveling like moths in the burning glare of these three false suns. In these pictures, Van Gogh seems to be using Japanese print techniques to unmask the falsity of modern life, exploiting the emotional power of black outline, sharply contrasted planes, harshly juxtaposed complementary colors. He pits the star-filled sky's eternal order against the city's tinsel and glitter. But the outcome is uncertain. The sky may be solid and convincing, but the stars look pale and insipid beside the livid glare of street lamps reflected in water. Van Gogh has discovered what we now call light pollution. Artificial light blinds us to the stars and even invades the city's surroundings, like this street lamp, which shows that yet another slice of countryside will soon be absorbed. Or this NASA satellite image, over a century on from Van Gogh, where the Earth itself resembles a star-filled sky. Before trying again, Van Gogh retreats from Arles to a village, where his brushwork changes radically. The Earth becomes as solid and immutable as the heavens, while the sky and stars take on the pyrotechnic sharpness and dynamism of modern artificial lighting. The result is spectacular, but frankly, over the top. This is genius run mad. Yet again, why is Van Gogh so bent on glorifying the power of the heavens? Is forgetting the stars really such a big deal? Regardless of what Van Gogh and other artists do with it, the night sky fascinates us because it puts us in touch with two fundamental things: beauty and the sublime. The classic vision of the heavens is that of an immense vault, which is beautiful because it stands for order and perfection. Seen from afar, the bright and everlasting stars seem utterly remote from our
Astronomy was really popular at the time. The video said there were books coming out with the first photos of the night sky, so that inspired a lot of the painting.
Anything else that we gathered from the video? Obsession with the stars. Okay, so there's a lot jam-packed into this painting, right? So this is an imagined landscape. This is not a vision that this is something he purely imagined, right? He purely imagined it. So this was not be seen outside of the studio. This was something he, took inspiration from the countryside, but he also took inspiration from his roots. That church that we see in the very bottom middle was Dutch, and you can tell it from the peaked roofs, right? Kind of let the snow off the side. And then his studio didn't face the sea. So it would have been something purely from his imagination, right? And so it does have the obsession with the natural world and that phenomenon that you were mentioning about the stars, and this kind of idea of how immense and how grand that sky is. It's a very romantic notion, this idea of the power of nature. But it has kind of a focus on rural life with Christian beliefs, with being that small little church kind of nestled at the bottom. But this giant cypress tree that kind of towers over the left side is a symbol of death. So we can see that it's much more complex than just necessarily a scene about swirling skies in the night sky, right? So how is it organized? How did he, put his imagery onto canvas? So Corona and well, Eva, what'd you guys get? How's it organized?
There's like an asymmetrical balance, and there are also vertical elements like the tree in the front, but also the church, and those create some depth. Like the video talked about a vanishing point, and even spirals kind of go into that.
Right, so we have these vertical elements, and they really do balance out all the horizontal elements. Notice how, right, if we look at it, he's really layered elements horizontally into foreground, middle ground, and background, right? So the cypress tree, right, is this vertical element, and that's something that's closest to us. But in the middle ground, we've got the city of Arles, we've got the hillside, right? Kind of these hills, and then we have the echo of the hills, the rolling hills. We have that in that tremendous sky. Notice how the sky, right, takes up 2/3 of the entire painting, right? So the focal point of this painting, right, there's a big emphasis on that sky, right? The focal point is the sky. So let's describe the style. I put some examples here too that went beyond the video. So let's describe the style. So Jeffrey and Cora.
It's not very realistic. It's definitely very kind of emotional.
Right? And so when we think about how it's emotional, right? Think about how it's emotional, thinking about the visual elements of it, it is thick. This painting is really thick. He slathered on the paint, right? When you go to a museum and you look at some of these expressionist paintings, what I would recommend that you do is get as close as you can to the painting. And that's one of the things that digital, looking at everything on the computer and on your phone, actually is, you don't really get an idea of how the thing was actually made because you don't get that close up. So when you go to a museum, kind of get close to the sentence will let you, the guard might yell at you, but look at it. You can see the thick marks of paint. You can see the raw canvas, and it kind of has this unblended kind of brushwork. There is actually bits of canvas coming through the painting. And you see that on the very edge. Notice how the edge of this painting is rough, right? That's the pure canvas coming through. Kind of has this unfinished quality to it. So he has lots of lines and patterns, right, in the sky and in the land. It kind of constructs the floor. So we see the slant with diagonal on the roof. We see the swirl in the sky because it's bending with the contours of the night winds, right? We have contrasting colors. So even though he was an expressionist, right, he's really obsessed with emotion, he knew what Seurat was doing, he knew what Cézanne was doing, and this idea of contrasting color, and he was in a way explaining with what happens when I have this warm yellow and this cool blue, and I don't want to make green, right? How am I ever able to get this idea of this night sky without making a bunch of green? Right? Because remember, he's working on the spot. Right? He's working on the spot. And so he was very much inspired by those Japanese prints that we saw. And so of course I put the Hokusai as a good example, because that's of course the only woodblock print we have in our 250 that's Japanese. And he was also inspired by medieval woodcuts. And so I found the swirling patterns of the water here as kind of an idea or inspiration too. Okay. Number 4, how is his work different from the Impressionists? How is his work different than the Impressionists? With Isabel and Katie.
It said that he like it wasn't as like sort of frivolous as like the Impressionists, because it was based on like poor people, and I liked how in the video they like zoomed into a window and it was like his other painting. And like it was kind of like the tension sort of nightlife and like a rest from work rather than like a party.
Yes. And so his work, he was really interested in capturing the mood, right? Which was kind of what you were getting at, this idea. He was more obsessed with capturing the mood than capturing the moment, right? He wanted to capture how it felt rather than what you saw, right? His work tends to be a mixture of memory, invention, and observation. So, Monet is going to go out and paint what he sees, or at least what he thinks he sees, right? And Van Gogh's kind of blending that together with his own imagination, as well as things that he can't see. He's not seeing the swirly sky, right? That's something that, well, maybe he wasn't seeing it. More than likely, he wasn't seeing the wind, right? But he was able to capture the wind in the sky. Some people think that it could have been on some of the drugs they had him on when he was painting this painting. He might have saw like blur, or tracery, that sort of thing. So it's possible he actually saw the swirly patterns that are evident in some of his works. But a lot of it is based on memory, right? The stars are all based on his memory, right? And why the night sky? Why did he paint the night sky? Alana?
Oh, I think I was assigned to the last question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Brianna, you have it?
For like a challenge.
Exactly, it's a challenge. And so he's trying to show those contrasting colors. How do I not make green? I mean, I see some green, but there's not a lot of green. So he really had to manipulate how, and honestly, because I paint, I know what he did. That's one of the reasons why this painting is so thick. It's because he's laying the color on top of the other color instead of mixing it. And so if you just kind of slather it on there, it's going to be on the surface rather than blending in with it. Right? And then where were they painted? Last one. The Raphael and Baruch. Where was he painting this image?
I got that he was painting it in France from like a mental asylum.
He was in, so he had to leave Arles because after he cut his ear, he had an episode, and Theo put him in a mental an asylum. That's what they called it back then. So he went into a hospital for mental health, and they put them there. And then his doctor, Gachet, one of his subject for his portrait, he was his doctor there. And so it was actually a different city. This church that you see here, as well as all of these landscape paintings, were done while he was there. And so he would actually get to leave the asylum. He get to walk the countryside and paint, but also he painted in his studio. And so that's where he was painting the Starry Night. Right? So here's some of his later paintings. Right? This is the last one that he painted before he shot himself with a shotgun. Okay. So we're going to move on to the Formalists, right? And the first group of Formalists that we have are often considered to be our symbolists. And so symbolists use color symbolically. They believe that, actually, we're not just in Formalists, we're in Expressionists too. They're show emotion. I apologize. Right? So what color stands out the most to you in this painting? What's the dominant color? Isabella. What's the dominant color?
Like red.
Red, exactly. And so this is Gauguin, who is the other artist that we have in our 250. Gauguin was a French artist who also was kind of like a self-taught artist. He started as a Sunday painter, so someone who painted just for his own enjoyment. He was a stockbroker, and when his career started to fail, he actually abandoned his whole family. So he had a wife and children. He leaves his family, and he starts to go to rural France, parts of Brittany, to paint these like ultra-religious people. So this group that we have here is basically like a religious sect. In a way, it might be seen like today as like people who are Amish or Quaker, right? These people who are living beyond normal society and were kind of like living on their own based on their religious faith. So this is actually a vision of Jacob wrestling an angel, right? So he eventually goes to the South Pacific. And the image that we're going to have in our 250 was done when he was living in Tahiti. So he abandons his family, goes to rural France, goes to Tahiti, right? And paints in Polynesia up until his death, right? So when we look at his early paintings, they're often considered to be primitive. And part of it is because he's an untrained artist, but also because he was painting subject matter that wasn't kind of the typical, right? He was doing that rural sort of pastoral life rather than the urban scene that were so common in the Impressionist time period, right? So like Van Gogh, he was often concerned with rural life. So it makes sense that he was interested in going to art, right? So this here is a Gauguin, and if you notice the background, and how it's outlined, very similar to the way that Van Gogh painted. And so this was made when he was working in that commune with Van Gogh, right? So Gauguin is probably one of those artists that I think would kind of, I'd love to have him disappear from the 250. There's a lot of, some people would call it like revisionist art history, but he basically was a misogynist, and this young lady was his lover. She was probably about 13. And so he painted the women that he painted his pseudo wives in Tahiti, and they were often very young. And so this one right here is called The Spirit of the Dead. And so he's trying, when he's in Tahiti, to show these people who are untouched by modern civilization. And so it's very kind of similar to like Manet's Olympia. It's their kind of fourth is like his gaze, right? So he goes to Tahiti, right? And he's painting all of these people. Now, the interesting thing is by the time he gets there, right? He's a Frenchman. Who colonized Tahiti? The French. So they weren't necessarily as primitive as he was hoping. They were wearing westernized clothing, like this hat that you see on these young ladies, right? But he was trying to show a earlier like a earlier period, right? And so that leads us to the piece that's in the 250 called "Where Do We Come From? What Are We? And Where Are We Going?" Right? And this is a very large painting. If you can see, it's actually in Boston. So that's where I'm standing in front of it, so that you kind of get an idea of the scale of it. Okay, so I tried to put some comparisons of other pieces as that we've seen before. And so I have our night at Enzor Palace as kind of an example. So when we look at this painting, do you think it's supposed to be viewed from left to right or right to left? Let's look at the painting. Where does it seem to start? From right to left or left to right? What do you think? What do you think?
Maybe right to left.
Yes, from right to left. So very similar to like the Sando painting that we saw. It starts from right to left. So I'm gonna skip it here. Right? Oh, I had it in the right order and I don't. You know what? I'll just keep going with it. So we'll just go back here. If we look at it, it starts with youth. So see the baby, and then we have some young people. The middle is supposed to be middle age. And then at the very end, we have an older lady. So this is kind of like the lifespan going across here, right? So let's describe his painting style. This would go under the form area on your note takers. What are some words you can use to describe his painting style? Maybe things that we've seen before, like Japanese prints or Van Gogh. Right? We have harsh contour lines. Notice how the detail is defined by those black outlines. So very much like a Japanese print, right? There's minimal rendering of light and shadow. You can see a little bit of modeling here. It has kind of the essence of three-dimensionality, but it's very minimal. We don't have light highlights, and we don't have dark shadows. Right? It has flat, kind of broad areas. Notice how the hand really is basically two values. It's like a yellow and a darker yellow. So it's like very flat areas. And when he painted this one, he was in Tahiti, and you know, art supplies weren't so like common in Tahiti. So he actually recycled some like burlap sacks and stitched them together. And so if you look at this close-up image, I took this picture here. This is where it was stitched together to make this colossal canvas. Right? So thinking about the painting's title, where do we come from, what are we, and where we're going, right? How does the painting answer the questions in the title, right? There's a little video here from Boston. You can, I can't believe I just said Boston. There you go, right there, if you want to look at it. But if we look at it, we can see that the background is like the natural environment of Tahiti, right? You see the ocean, you see volcanoes, you see the lush greenery. You also see some like indigenous like sculptures of like the gods and ancestors. It has text in the upper right corner. On the right, this is kind of the beginning of it. He wrote a letter to his friend, right, when he's trying to sell this painting, and he described this painting. He said that he had a sleeping child with 3 crouching women on the right, and they represent the beginning of life, right? The 2 women in purple, right, are there confiding with each other. And then there's an enormous crouching figure who's kind of out of proportion, right? Who is kind of like thinking about, right? So it says, intentionally so, raises its arm to stare in astonishment upon the 2 who dare think about their destiny. So he is looking at these 2 as they converse about what their life is going to be like. And remember that this is like the start of life. This is kind of like the optimism and thinking about what your life is going to be like. In the middle, we actually have this figure who's picking fruit, and that's supposed to represent your adulthood. This is you with your labor, right? What you're going to do for your life, right? And this is your productive part of your life, right? And then on the left, we have 2 cats near a child. I think there's 2 little white cats there. We have a goat. We have an idol with his arm raised to kind of indicate the beyond. And then lastly, there's an old woman who is got her hands up to her head, right? And she's kind of resigned to her thoughts, right? And she's kind of like the end of the story. And he says that too, with an exclamation point. when we look at it, there's different birds, there's lizards, there's all these different animals on this side. So possibly kind of like spiritual symbols there. So when you look at the whole scene, you'll notice that the corners, right, instead of being sky, have these yellow areas to them, right? They're kind of reminiscent of things that we've probably seen before, right? They've got an intentional connection with like Christian imagery. And so he added that gold so that it would be similar to these religious icons of Christianity. There's also kind of native imagery too. We have this god Hina, right, who's a protector image. And then also this man in the center is supposed to be this Maku, which was a special caste of men who supposedly had mystical powers. That's our expressionists. So we'll zip through some of our formalists here because I took way too much time talking about Van Gogh. So our formalists are really interested in the act of painting, the scientific mixing of color, and the organization of space. So probably one of the most famous that you know is Seurat, so George Seurat. And so he did a lot of scenes of leisure, parks, that sort of thing. And so his brushstroke is little small dots of color. And so these are all studies that he did based on observation. So he would go, like Monet, to a place and make sketches. So instead of doing his formal paintings outdoors, he did these sketches, and he was really interested in color mixing. And so the art, this is the one that is Sunday afternoon on the island of Manjot, which is at the Art Institute. You know, this colossal painting. And so because the dots are so small, it looks pretty smooth. Like obviously when you look at it up close, you can see that it's made based on a bunch of dots of color. And so he's basically representing all of these people who go to the park on a Sunday afternoon, right? They're all different classes. So we've got workers, we've got upper class in our top hat, we've got this woman with the monkey. Supposedly she is a like a sex worker, and so that's what the monkey is all about. She's with like a high clientele or her high client. So like kind of like the Olympia that we saw by Manet. So we got all of these people, and we got lots and lots of repetition. He was really interested in kind of that formal quality of like Egyptian painting. Notice how stiff people are, right? And his images have a lot of like nightlife, right? His kind of have more of this kind of wonderful society is great. It's all based on little dots of color that if you stood back from, he believed you would be able to see pure rendering, like they would visually mix. So if I put enough blue and yellow together, you're going to optically see green. He doesn't need to make green. So here's the studio. By the end of his career, which was not too late, I think he died in his 30s. He really understood that he couldn't make it visually mixed. Like there was no way it was going to perfectly blend because he couldn't make the dots well enough. So then he just started making the dots bigger and to make them more evident, like this. Right? So the next artist that we have is called Cézanne. And Cézanne was an Impressionist painter. He pretty much was an original Impressionist. He always exhibited with them, but he was kind of always on the outs with them. He was considered an outsider because his subject matter wasn't as happy and cheerful and pastel as the rest of them. So a lot of his early scenes are kind of remind me of Van Gogh. They're very dark, they're very dingy, they're kind of sad. They often coined him as the depressed Impressionist, right? And he's known for two things. He's known for known for his landscapes. And of course, they put a landscape for him in the 250. What I love about Cézanne is he could care less about realism. There are a bunch of issues with this painting that if I was his art teacher, I'd be like, you need to fix these things before you call it finished, right? Notice, this is the edge of the table. What the hell happens on the left, right? When I look at the view, it looks like to me that this is a front view of a bottle, but then when I look at the fabric with the oranges and the lady fingers and the bowl of fruit, it's like I'm above it, right? So it's got multiple points of view. And he was really inspirational to people like Picasso, so the Cubist artists that we're going to look at when we get back from break, right? He loved combinations of color, and he did a lot of warm cool. So like Van Gogh was experimenting with warm and cool colors, Cézanne was too. So he did a lot of colors that were warm and contrasting with cool. And so the other subject matter that he was known for was his landscapes. And he had a studio. He became kind of a recluse and went out and painted on the outskirts in France, and he painted a series on Sainte-Victoire, which is this mountain that we have in the distance. And this is what it looks like today, right? So he painted this over and over again. Now, when we look at his paintings, let's focus on how he constructs the form, right? So I want you to think about Van Gogh, right? Think about how intentional and how he thought about the direction of his brushstroke. When you look at the mountains, can you see that his brushstroke defines the mountain? So when you look here, you see vertical lines to represent the height on certain parts of the mountain. And then on other parts, there is diagonal to represent the slope, right? And there's kind of like this, you see individual brushstrokes, but then also you see kind of like flatter areas, right? So when he was painting these, right, he wasn't being all emotional about it, right? He was trying to define the form. He was trying to define, what does this mountain look like? How do I make it look 3D? Using brush stroke, not modeling, not making it look smooth, but how can I use individual brush strokes to define the form? So he used all different kinds of marks. Some of them are pretty rough, like the one that we have in our 250, all right? There's a smart history video on another painting. This one is slightly different. I think this one does a really good job of showing us all those individual brush strokes that Seurat was, or Paul Seurat, I think I called it originally, was obsessed with. Right? So what emphasizes the mountain, the plane, or the brush stroke? Where's your eye go? I know what my eye is attracted to. And then what do you think?
I'm drawn to the plane because of the bright colors.
Exactly. My eye goes to the plane as well because it's so vivid and so rich. Those beautiful bright greens, right? But when we look at that green, right, we really notice the brushwork too, right? Notice how there's patches of color. There's all different kinds of marks to kind of illustrate the form, right? So when we describe the form, right, we see those individual brush strokes and we see different flat planes of color, right? That's the style that he's really known for. You also see that he uses some lines, but it's broken. It's not as defined as Gauguin, right? Gauguin is going to outline the entire contour, but here he just puts a line wherever it's needed to separate it between the sky and the mountain, right? He only defines what he needs to define. There's kind of a minimal sort of quality to it. And then on these paintings of the landscape, he divides up the space, right? Kind of like Van Gogh did too, where he is doing the foreground, the middle ground, and then the background is kind of this combo of sky mountain. And when I look at this, I kind of see that impressionist quality, right? Because, you know, why is the sky and the mountain exactly the same color, right? So what was the weather like in this day? You know, that sort of thing. You know, there's not a lot of atmospheric perspective here. Okay. So that is our post-impressionist. So now we're going to move into our expressionists. We probably won't finish all of this today, which is probably good for you guys. You guys are probably reaching capacity here. But we will go ahead and look at some of these later expressionists and thinking about the human psyche, right? How are they conveying their human psyche? Right? So these are often considered to be our early expressionists. Right? And so this is James Enzor. His parents made masquerade masks. So things you would wear at like Mardi Gras or like Venice with the masquerade. And so a lot of his scenes have people who look like they're wearing masks. He's not a big fan of contemporary society and thinks people are hiding themselves and not showing their true selves. So a lot of his paintings have those scary masks, talk about social ills of the day. Right? So let's go ahead and move on to Edvard Munch, or Munch, I should say, who is in our 250. His early career, right? We're looking at his early career. He did interior scenes at the home, and he did outdoor scenes of leisure. Look at all those umbrellas and all those dots. You can see how he was emulating the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, right? Using typical scenes of Impressionism, Post-Impressionism. When he was young, his mother and some of the other members of his family got tuberculosis. And so a lot of his paintings deal with sickness and ill health, and he kind of became famous because of it. So, you know, he's rising in the ranks of painting, and he's kind of known for these sickly paintings, so he kind of goes with it. Even when he no longer felt the severe depression of losing a mother and having sickness all around him, we always see the kind of the essence of sickness around. This image is about love, or the suffocating nature of love. So here we have this corpse-like couple, right, dancing in a crowd, and then we have the same woman on the left and the right. So here she's kind of like young and pretty. She falls in love, and now she's basically like an old sad woman on the side, right? So it kind of shows what it's like to be in love at this time, or at least his vision of it. Right? So that leads us to the screen, right? So looking at the screen, like Edvard Munch, right? So we've seen this painting so many times before, right? We've seen this painting so many times before, but what I want to do is, we're not going to do a lot of in-depth research on this, but what I want to do is just kind of do what I say, a close reading. So for a close reading is, I want us to look at it closely. Okay, we're going to look at it closely. Since we don't have a lot of time, right, let's look at this mood, right? What's the mood like in this painting, right? What do we feel is going on? It's called the scream, right? So he's screaming, right? He's scared, he's screaming, he's got his hands on his ears, his mouth is open up, and he's screaming, right? So what are the ways that he achieves this mood, right? What are the different visual things that represent the scary nature of this painting? Go ahead. ahead and write a couple of your ideas in the chat. There are multiple things, so try to really look at all the different elements. Look at the foreground, look at the background, look at the middle ground. Okay, so I'm getting your comments in. You're good, right? So the mood is kind of terrified, right? He feels kind of isolated. He feels very disturbed. And he does this in a number of ways. So many of you guys commented about the figure itself, right? Notice that the figure looks kind of like an alien. It reminds me of all those alien abduction images. So it's very minimal. He's very abstracted. We know it's a person because it has eyes, nose, mouth, hands, right? But I couldn't go, oh, I know who this person is, right? So it's unrecognizable. We have that blood red sky that swirls above him. We have the swirling nature of the water and the land in the background. We have the long visible brush strokes. Notice, like Van Gogh, you can see all of the different marks in the sky, right? In the bridge, in the water, even in his clothing. His expression, he has his mouth open. He is in the act of screaming, right? It's that exaggerated perspective. Notice the angles of the railing and the walk, right? The walkway. And then there's these strange silhouetted figures on the bridge coming towards this person, and we don't know who they are, right? So who are they? Are they going to hurt him? Are they going to harm him? We don't know. So Munch, when he was writing about this, talked about how he felt like the sky was screaming at him. And one of the reasons for that is because Krakatoa in Indonesia erupted in the year that he painted this. And so the blood red sky that we see was caused by the smoke in the atmosphere. So I actually have recognized this before. Once because my husband was in Guatemala and there was a bunch of volcanoes going off in Guatemala and he was stuck there. And then in Chicago, we were actually getting aftermath. We were getting all this smoke and volcanic ash that was coming up the jet stream into our atmosphere. So at night, we had the most beautiful sunset. And so this was happening where he was living in Northern Europe, where the sky was blood red, right? So he actually saw kind of that as like an ominous field. He was also really interested in primitive art and go to museums, and he loved looking at Peruvian mummies. And if you've ever noticed the Peruvian mummies, their eyes, their nose, their mouth look very similar to some of these figures that you see on the bridge, right? Even going back to the one that we have here in our 250. He made 4 different versions of this artwork, all in different medias. He also has a print, actually his 5, he has a black and white print on it as well. Here's some other images, all relating to death and sickness. Okay. I'm gonna have a stop there. This is actually the breakout group. Finally, I made Raphael open his computer today. And we finally got to the breakout group at the very end. So we'll start with this when we get back from break, and we'll be able to finish in time for our quiz on Friday. Okay? So have a great, wonderful break. Thank you for your patience today. I appreciate it. And then if you guys have any questions,